In April of 1947, nearly 2 full years after Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri had officially ended the Second World War, a small group of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle caves of Peleliu, the same island whose brutal 76-day battle this channel has covered in an earlier episode, and finally laid down their weapons. These men had spent nearly 2 years continuing to hide, survive, and in some cases actively resist, on an island the rest of the world had long since considered fully secured, refusing to believe that the war had actually ended, and that continued resistance served no purpose at all. This is the story of what happened to these holdout soldiers, men whose personal war continued years after every other combatant on Earth had already returned to peacetime life, and the broader, stranger phenomenon of Japanese soldiers who simply could not, or would not, accept that the fighting was finally over. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How does a group of soldiers convince themselves, for nearly 2 years, that the entire outside world reporting their country's surrender is lying to them? The Umurbrogol Ridge Systems Cave Network, discussed in detail in this channel's earlier episode on the Battle of Peleliu, extended across a genuinely vast and complex underground area, interconnected passages and chambers that American forces had never fully mapped or cleared even during the battle's most intensive fighting, meaning the physical possibility of individual soldiers or small groups surviving undetected within this network for an extended period was, in retrospect, considerably more plausible than it might initially appear, given just how difficult the terrain had already proven for American forces to fully control, even with the full resources of an active military campaign committed to the task. It is worth noting that the holdout phenomenon, while most famously associated with these later, decades-long individual cases, was actually a considerably more widespread occurrence in the immediate post-war years than popular memory of the war typically acknowledges, with American and Japanese authorities locating and repatriating isolated groups of Japanese soldiers from various Pacific islands for years after the war's official conclusion, the Peleliu case representing one of the better documented examples of a broader pattern, rather than an entirely isolated anomaly. The Battle of Peleliu, fought through the autumn of 1944, officially ended in late November of that year, when American forces declared the island secured after weeks of brutal fighting against Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's cave-based defensive network in the Umurbrogol Ridges. But the declaration of an island's official capture and the actual elimination of every armed Japanese soldier hiding within its extensive cave systems were, in practice, 2 very different things, and a small number of Japanese personnel, separated from what remained of organized command structure during the battle's final chaotic weeks, retreated deeper into the island's cave network rather than surrendering or dying in the fighting that claimed most of their garrison. These remaining soldiers, cut off from any reliable communication with Japanese command, and lacking any confirmed information about how the broader war was actually progressing, settled into a survival pattern that combined hiding from American patrols with occasional small-scale raids or foraging expeditions to obtain food and supplies, a precarious existence that stretched on for months and then years as the broader Pacific War continued, and eventually concluded entirely without their knowledge or participation. The exact number of holdouts involved in the Peleliu case has been documented somewhat differently across various historical accounts, with most sources placing the group at somewhere between 2 and 3 dozen men by the time of their eventual surrender in 1947. Though the group's composition likely shifted over the intervening years through a combination of deaths from illness, accident, or occasional armed encounters with American patrols, and the group's own internal cohesion under a recognized leadership structure that helped maintain organized survival efforts throughout the extended holdout period. News of Japan's surrender in August of 1945, when it eventually reached these isolated holdouts through various channels, including leaflets, loudspeaker broadcasts, and other efforts American forces made across the Pacific, specifically to reach exactly this kind of isolated remaining Japanese personnel, was met with deep and, from the Holdouts' perspective, entirely reasonable skepticism. These men had been trained and conditioned throughout years of wartime service to expect enemy propaganda specifically designed to convince Japanese soldiers to surrender, through false claims about the war's progress or outcome, and a surrender announcement delivered through the same channels used for wartime propaganda efforts fit exactly the pattern they had been warned to distrust. Japanese wartime training doctrine had, in fact, specifically prepared soldiers to expect exactly this kind of psychological warfare from American forces, briefing personnel that enemy propaganda would likely include fabricated claims about Japanese defeat or surrender specifically designed to undermine continued resistance. A doctrinal preparation that, while intended to strengthen wartime morale and resistance, had the unintended long-term consequence of making genuine surrender announcements, once the war had actually ended, considerably harder for isolated soldiers to accept as authentic rather than simply another iteration of the same propaganda technique they had been specifically trained to distrust. This skepticism was compounded by the Holdouts' complete isolation from any independent confirmation of what was actually happening in the broader world. Stranded on a small Pacific island with no functioning radio equipment of their own and no trusted source of information beyond what American forces, whom they had every reason to view as the enemy, actively trying to trick them into surrendering, chose to broadcast or distribute, in leaflet form, across the island. The specific content of the leaflets and broadcasts American forces used to try reaching isolated Japanese holdouts across the Pacific evolved over the years following the war's end, incorporating increasingly detailed evidence intended to overcome exactly the kind of skepticism these men had been trained to maintain, including reproductions of Japanese newspaper coverage of the surrender, photographs of post-war Japan, and eventually direct appeals from family members and former commanding officers specifically recorded or written to reach particular known or suspected holdout groups, a systematic and evolving effort that reflected genuine, sustained American and Japanese governmental concern about the continued existence of isolated combatants years after the war's official conclusion. Stop and consider what nearly 2 years of this actually looked like in practice, because the abstract description of continued resistance understates the genuine physical and psychological difficulty involved. These men lived in an extended state of survival, moving carefully to avoid detection, subsisting on whatever food they could forage or occasionally take from supplies, maintaining weapons and equipment that had received no resupply since the battle's original end, and doing all of this while genuinely believing, based on their own understanding of the information available to them, that they remained combatants in an ongoing war rather than survivors of a conflict that had, in reality, concluded years earlier. Encounters between American patrols and the holdouts during this extended period occasionally turned violent, since the holdouts, still believing themselves active combatants, treated American search efforts as continued enemy military operations rather than rescue or surrender attempts. A dangerous dynamic that meant the years-long effort to locate and recover these isolated soldiers carried genuine ongoing risk for American personnel involved in the search, quite apart from the more obvious hardship and danger the holdouts themselves continued to face throughout their extended isolation. American forces on Peleliu, aware that some number of Japanese personnel likely remained hidden in the island's extensive cave systems even after the battle's official conclusion, made periodic efforts over the following years to locate and either capture or convince these remaining holdouts to surrender. Efforts complicated by the same cave network's extensive, difficult to fully map interior that had made the original battle so costly and prolonged in the first place. The daily reality of survival for these men, involved a level of resourcefulness and physical endurance that historians studying the case have found genuinely remarkable. Maintaining shelter within the cave systems, developing sustainable methods of obtaining food through a combination of foraging, limited cultivation, and occasional supply raids, and preserving what functioning weapons and equipment remained from the original battle without any resupply or maintenance support of any kind. A sustained survival effort that, whatever the ultimately mistaken belief driving it, required genuine skill and discipline to maintain successfully across nearly 2 full years. By early 1947, with the Holdouts' continued presence on Peleliu, still confirmed through occasional sightings and evidence of activity, Japanese and American authorities coordinated a more deliberate and carefully planned effort, specifically to convince the remaining soldiers that the war had genuinely ended. This effort involved sending a Japanese officer to the island specifically to communicate directly with the Holdouts. Someone whose Japanese nationality and military background carried a credibility with the isolated soldiers that American broadcasts and leaflets, however accurate, simply could not match, given the Holdouts' deep and understandable distrust of information coming directly from what they still considered an active enemy force. The specific selection of which Japanese officer to send for this final effort reflected careful consideration of exactly what kind of credibility and authority would be needed to overcome the Holdouts' deeply entrenched distrust, with planners recognizing that the messenger's own military background and manner of presentation needed to align closely enough with the Holdouts' own understanding of legitimate military authority to register as genuinely trustworthy information, rather than simply another variation of the propaganda efforts they had already spent nearly 2 years successfully resisting. This direct, credible communication, combined with physical evidence including newspapers, photographs, and other material documentation of the war's actual conclusion and Japan's post-war circumstances, finally succeeded in convincing the remaining Holdouts that continued resistance no longer served any purpose, since the war they believed themselves still fighting had, in fact, concluded nearly 2 years earlier. The eventual surrender itself was conducted with considerable care and formality, reflecting an awareness among both American and Japanese authorities involved that these men, after nearly 2 years believing themselves still at war, required a genuinely persuasive and respectful process to accept a surrender that, unlike the war's actual conclusion, needed to feel authentic and complete to soldiers who had maintained their resistance specifically because they doubted the authenticity of every previous surrender communication they had received. The Holdouts finally emerged and surrendered in April of 1947, bringing to an end one of the more remarkable individual postscripts to the entire Pacific War. A group of men whose personal experience of the conflict extended years beyond its actual historical conclusion. These men returned to a Japan that had, in the nearly 2 years since the war's actual conclusion, already begun the substantial process of post-war reconstruction and social transformation under American occupation authority, meaning the Holdouts faced not only the psychological adjustment of learning the war had ended, but the practical challenge of reintegrating into a society that had already moved considerably further along its own post-war recovery than these men, isolated on a remote Pacific island, could have possibly anticipated or prepared for during their extended period of continued resistance. The psychological transition these men faced upon finally accepting that the war had ended, and had in fact been over for nearly 2 years, involved processing an experience genuinely difficult to fully comprehend. Years of continued sacrifice, danger, and hardship endured in service of a war effort that had, unbeknownst to them, already concluded, meaning the specific risks and privations of their final 2 years on Peleliu had, in the most literal sense, served no military purpose whatsoever beyond their own survival. Several accounts of similar holdout cases documented in the years and decades following the Peleliu group's surrender, describe a common pattern of profound disorientation among these men upon finally accepting the war's true conclusion. A psychological experience some later commentators have compared to a form of delayed grief, mourning not just years of the men's own lives spent in continued unnecessary hardship, but the specific, painful recognition that comrades who had died during the extended holdout period had done so in service of a war effort that had, in strict military terms, already concluded before their deaths occurred at all. This realization, arriving all at once after years of gradual, isolated hardship, represented its own distinct form of psychological difficulty, separate from the physical challenges of the holdout period itself. Onoda's own case, examined in greater detail, reveals just how specifically and rigidly some Japanese officers had been trained to resist exactly the kind of surrender announcement his commanders had eventually needed to overcome. Onoda had been given direct orders before the war's end that explicitly instructed him to disregard any report of Japan's surrender or defeat, unless it arrived through his own specific chain of command, an instruction intended at the time to prevent enemy deception from ending a legitimate intelligence and guerrilla mission, but one that, once the war actually did end, left Onoda with a documented, formal justification for continuing to disregard every subsequent surrender announcement, search party, and piece of evidence presented to him over the following 29 years. Since none of it arrived through the specific command channel his original orders had specified as the only acceptable source of a legitimate recall. The Peleliu holdouts were not an isolated or unique case within the broader history of the Pacific War's aftermath, but rather represented one of the earlier and better documented examples of a phenomenon that would continue to surface, in increasingly rare and remarkable individual cases, for decades following the war's official conclusion. The most famous of these later cases involved Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese intelligence officer who continued hiding and conducting guerrilla-style activity on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, nearly 3 full decades after Japan's surrender. Finally persuaded to emerge only after his own former commanding officer traveled to the island specifically to issue him a direct, personal order, relieving him of his mission, since Onoda had been trained to disregard any surrender announcement that did not come through his own specific chain of command. When Onoda finally did emerge in 1974, his former commanding officer, tracked down specifically for this purpose, decades after their original wartime service together, traveled personally to Lubang Island and issued Onoda a direct formal order, relieving him of his intelligence and guerrilla mission, precisely the kind of authoritative, chain-of-command communication Onoda's original orders had specified as the only acceptable basis for ending his continued resistance, a resolution that required Japanese authorities to essentially recreate the exact command relationship and communication channel Onoda had been trained to trust, since nothing less specific would have overcome 3 decades of disciplined, doctrinally justified resistance. Another holdout, Teruo Nakamura, was located on the Indonesian island of Morotai later the same year, becoming perhaps the final confirmed Japanese holdout of the entire war, emerging into a world that had changed almost unrecognizably from the one he had last known nearly 3 decades earlier. Onoda himself, upon his eventual return to Japan, struggled visibly with the transition to civilian life in a country and a world that had changed almost beyond recognition during his 3 decades of continued jungle resistance, a difficulty severe enough that he eventually relocated to Brazil for a period, working in agriculture, before later returning to Japan and becoming, somewhat unexpectedly, a public figure who spoke and wrote about survival skills and his own extraordinary wartime experience, a post-war life trajectory that, while unusual, reflected the genuine and lasting difficulty many holdouts faced in reconciling decades of isolated, doctrinally justified resistance with the ordinary demands of post-war civilian existence. These holdout cases, considered collectively, illustrate something genuinely distinctive about the psychological and doctrinal conditioning many Japanese soldiers received throughout the war. A combination of intense distrust of enemy communications, strict deference to formal chain-of-command authority for any order as consequential as surrender, and, in several documented cases, specific training that explicitly anticipated and warned against exactly the kind of surrender propaganda these men would eventually encounter. A conditioning so effective that it kept individual soldiers functionally at war for years, and in the most extreme cases decades, after the conflict that had trained them to fight had already concluded. Historians studying this phenomenon have noted that it reflects, in an unusually stark and prolonged individual form, the same broader pattern this channel has documented elsewhere regarding Japanese military culture's emphasis on continued resistance and resistance to surrender. A cultural and doctrinal pattern that, in the specific and remarkable case of men like the Peleliu Holdouts and Hiroo Onoda, extended the practical experience of the Pacific War for certain individuals years and even decades beyond, when the rest of the world had already moved on to an entirely different post-war era. Remember the question this story opened with. How does a group of soldiers convince themselves for nearly 2 years that the entire outside world reporting their country's surrender is lying to them? The honest answer, established through the documented training and psychology of Japanese wartime military doctrine, is that they were not simply choosing to disbelieve. They had been specifically and effectively trained to disbelieve, prepared throughout their military service to expect exactly the kind of surrender propaganda they eventually encountered, a preparation so thorough and so doctrinally reinforced that it took a specially selected messenger, physical evidence gathered specifically for the purpose, and, in the most extreme individual cases like Onoda's, the literal recreation of an original chain of command decades later, to finally overcome it. If you want to understand how a group of soldiers convinced themselves the entire outside world was lying to them for nearly 2 years, and how this remarkable pattern of isolated, prolonged resistance continued to surface in individual cases for decades after Japan's actual surrender, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.